So evolutionary adaptations often involve multiple interacting mutations. For example, the evolution of a signaling protein to bind a new target ligand, or the evolution of pathogens to adapt to new drugs or to escape our immune systems. Also, the development of cancer within our own somatic tissues can be seen as the consequence of a stem cell lineage acquiring several interacting mutations that allow it to adapt by escaping the innate checks on cell growth. And if the individual mutations that are contributing to such an adaptation do not confer individual fitness benefits, then the population has to cross a fitness valley or plateau in order to adapt. So, for example, if two mutations confer some fitness advantage, but an individual mutation is deleterious, the population has to cross a fitness valley, illustrated here, where I'm denoting the fitness cost of a mutation as delta and the selective benefit as S. If delta is equal to 0, this is a sort of similar situation where instead a single mutant genotype has no advantage, but two mutations are beneficial. We call this situation a fitness plateau. And the problem is that for a population to adapt across a fitness valley or plateau, it's the classic idea we have of individual mutations sequentially reaching fixation is difficult, very unlikely to occur. So here, the situation where a single mutant comes in and sweeps or spreads to fixation by drift, and a double mutant comes in, is unlikely if the individual single mutations are not beneficial. So the problem is, in small populations, there's just not enough mutations. And in large populations, only beneficial mutations are likely to fix. And so this process would take very long. However, large asexual populations can cross valleys by fixing the mutations simultaneously in a process that's called tunneling. And so it's important, so the tunneling process I've illustrated here is showing, so repeatedly single mutants are entering the population, most of them die out. Eventually we get a single mutant lineage that survives and produces a double mutant that establishes and sweeps to fixation. And now both mutations can spread simultaneously instead of having to fix individually. And critically, if the population is asexual or if the mutations are closely genetically linked, such as in the same gene, then we don't have to worry about recombination breaking up these mutations. And so this tunneling process has been studied extensively, specifically in the last 2 decades, and in unstructured populations, and is thought to occur on relevant evolutionary timescales in pathogens and also in the development of cancer. However, most natural populations are spatially structured. In particular, many are subdivided into discrete subpopulations or demes with individuals competing and reproducing within local regions much smaller than the total geographic range. So examples that we're familiar with include islands or patches of forest that harbor macroscopic organism populations, and then with microscopic organisms, we have, for example, floral communities that each host an independent bacterial population, or for pathogens and cancer-susceptible stem cells, subdivision can be imposed by the structure of human tissues. And so it's important to understand how subdivision affects valley crossing in order to understand how we can predict what's happening in real systems. And so I used mathematical modeling to determine the effects of subdivision on valley crossing in asexual populations. And in particular, I sought to address 3 questions. First, under what conditions, such as total population sizes and mutation rates, is it possible for subdivision to decrease the waiting time for the population to adapt? And second, I wanted to come up with quantitative predictions for how the average time for the population to adapt varied with the degree of subdivision in some simple model. And third, I wanted to consider the probability distribution and ask, how does subdivision affect the probability that a population adapts very rapidly? And so, as an outline of the talk, I'm first going to describe my results for the general conditions for subdivision to decrease the waiting time for the population to adapt. And then I will discuss my quantitative predictions for the average time in a simple model. And finally, I'll describe results on the probability distribution and the probability of rapid adaptation. And for further information, please stop by my poster tomorrow, or look for a preprint, hopefully online on bioRxiv in the next few weeks. Okay, so just as a reminder, I'm studying tunneling in asexual, or valley crossing in asexual populations. And so this is the basic genetic model I'm using. I'm assuming initially the population is wild type, and I'm asking how long does it take for a beneficial double mutant to spread through the population. The double mutant has a fitness benefit of S, I'm assuming it's strongly beneficial, and the single mutant has a fitness coefficient of delta, negative fitness coefficient of delta, which may be 0, allowing for a fitness plateau. And so when I'm describing the conditions for significant effects of subdivision, I'm going to use a very general model. So we have a subdivided population. I'm assuming that individuals compete and reproduce within demes, and that each deme has a fixed number of individuals, and that migration exchanges individuals between demes. So these assumptions are collectively known as soft selection and conservative migration, but I'm not going to make any assumptions about a specific pattern of migration or specific sizes of demes. And so we can ask, in this very general situation, what is the effect of subdivision on valley crossing? And so to do that, it's useful to consider valley crossing by tunneling as being broken into 3 phases. So this is the illustration I had before, although I've changed the y-axis to say total population frequency to emphasize that I'm thinking of a subdivided population, and I'm thinking about these single mutants as occurring in the total population. They're rare in the total population, but they may not be rare with respect to an individual subpopulation. Okay, so the 3 phases. First, we need to wait for this, what I call the successful single mutant, the mutant that will eventually have offspring that take over the population. And this time I call T0. And then once the successful single mutant occurs, we have to wait another T1 generations for the successful single mutant to drift and produce a double mutant that sweeps. And then finally we have this sweep time, TS, that I denote TSW. And we can think of the total process of adaptation as being the sum of these 3 times. So in order to understand the effects of subdivision, we can just consider what happens to the fate of an individual single mutant that enters the population. And the key effect of subdivision in this general model I'm considering is that it allows single mutants to survive longer and produce more double mutants. So if we consider a situation, a population with high migration, single mutants will be evenly distributed, as I'm showing here, and so rare single mutants are exposed to competition with wild type. However, if migration is low, then single mutants may become common in 1 or more demes while still being rare in the total population, and they're protected from competition with wild type. So these single mutants can persist longer. And so if single mutants are able to fix within a deme, because deme sizes and migration rates are low, then they're able to be much more likely to produce a successful double mutant. And so if we go back to this picture, subdivision is going to decrease this initial time T0. However, something that might not be immediately obvious, but you can show, is that at the same time that T0 is decreased, the times, the sweep time and the time T1 are both increased. So there is something of a trade-off. And so the conditions for subdivision to significantly accelerate valley crossing by decreasing the average time for the population to adapt is 1, successful single mutants must be able to become common or near fixation in 1 or more demes, which means that demes and migration rates have to be small, and also that the average waiting time has to be limited by this initial step, T0. And it might not be immediately obvious, and I'm happy to talk about it later, but the total population size can't be too big for this to happen. So these are the 2 general conditions that we need for subdivision to decrease the average time to adaptation. So in order to get some analytical predictions to understand how subdivision quantitatively affects valley crossing, I use the island model, the simplest model of structure, where there's L demes, each with n individuals, for NL times L total individuals. And individuals migrate at a rate, per capita rate of m, to a randomly chosen deme. And I'm going to vary subdivision by varying the size of demes and the migration rate. And I'll be comparing a subdivided population to an unstructured population of the same total size. And for this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the situation where the total population size is large, but the demes are small, because this is where you get the largest effect. And so I was able to analytically solve for the dynamics. It's by essentially treating different parameter regimes with different approximations. There's, as you might imagine, with this many parameters, there are well over 10 different parameter regimes giving different qualitative dynamics and different dependencies on the deme size and migration rate. So I'm just going to give you one example here. And in this specific case that I'll consider, there's a large number of small demes, as I mentioned. So the single mutants are always going to be rare in the total population, but they may become frequent within demes if the migration rates are low. And the population as a whole is not going to be too large, and it's not going to be too small. And so T0 is going to be limiting at high migration rates, which means there's some potential for subdivision to help. But T1 is going to be limiting at low migration rates. And I'll explain that a little bit more on the next slide. And then finally, this case I'm considering, single mutants are deleterious but they're neutral with respect to an individual deem, so they can neutrally fix within a deem, which is important because if selection prevents single mutants from fixing within deems, it's harder for subdivision to have an effect on accelerating valley crossing. Okay, so just to go back to this picture, I'm going to ignore the sweep time and just consider the waiting time for the sweep to start, which is going to be equal to T0 plus T1. And so I'm just showing this picture to remind you that there's this trade-off I mentioned between T0 and T1 is going to be important when we try to consider how the average time to adapt depends on the migration rate. And so I'm going to show you one example where we vary the migration rate from very high to very low and look at the average time. And so when we do this, the average time decreases as migration rate decreases. And here I'm showing you on the x-axis migration rate on a log scale. On the right-hand side, we have a migration rate of 1, which is complete panmixia, everyone migrating every generation. On the left, we have very low migration rate, almost no migration between deems. And on the y-axis, we have the average time until the sweep starts, varying from 1 million generations up to over 100 million generations. And what we see is that high migration rates, there's almost no effect of subdivision. The average time until the successful double mutant occurs is basically the same as in an unstructured population with the same total size. And there's no effect until we get to this threshold of a migration rate of 1 over 2ne generations, which many of you will be familiar with as just the classic result for when you get genetic differentiation in the neutral island model, haplogroup neutral island model. And once we get to the lower migration rates, single mutants that can fix within deems, and then we find that the average time to successful double mutant decreases greatly over a wide range of migration rates until we reach a lower bound, which occurs when this trade-off between T0 and T1 starts to cancel out. And you can show that this is a theoretical lower bound for the effects of structure, any type of spatial structure. And so in large populations, this bound is already met and there's no benefit of structure. So I finally just want to point out that these predictions are closely matched by Wright-Fisher simulations. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that the average time is not always the relevant quantity. We often need to consider the probability that adaptation happens within a certain period of time. For example, in evolutionary rescue, we care about the probability of adaptation before population extinction. And in cancer, we care about the probability that a stem cell acquires multiple mutations before the human dies. And so I looked at the probability distribution and I kind of surprised, I wasn't really expecting this, but I found that subdivision only increases the probability of adaptation at times that are longer than this unstructured average T1. And so what I'm showing you here is on the x-axis is time on a log scale, and on the y-axis is probability of a successful double mutant having occurred by the given time. And so if we look at the probability distribution in gray for an unstructured population and in orange for a subdivided population, we see that until we get to a time corresponding to the average of T1 for the unstructured population, the probability distributions are exactly overlapping. And it's only at later times that the probability is greater in the subdivided population. And this is very important if you're actually thinking about an experimental system where you might be doing an experiment over a short time period, or if you're making predictions for cancer. And this is something that some other recent work on this related topics have been actually kind of ignoring this for mathematical reasons. Okay, so just to recap, subdivision allows these neutral and deleterious lineages to survive longer, and so they can be more likely to produce beneficial genotypes. However, there's only a significant effect if the lineages can fix within deems. So we need deems and migration rates to not be to be small, and we need the total population to be large so that the time is limited by T0. And then finally, the probability of adaptation is only helped at these earlier times, it's only helped at these later times that are later than these average T1. And so even though all of this was for these quantitative results were for the island model, these three conclusions are very general to any type of subdivision. And actually also these trade-offs that I mentioned are very general to continuously distributed populations. And so even though it's sort of this, I used a toy model, all of this stuff is very useful for trying to understand how structure in real systems will play a role. And thanks.